My wife left me after 42 years of marriage for another man. I didn't fight her. I didn't beg her to stay. I signed the divorce papers with a smile, because she had no idea. I had already moved everything she wanted beyond her reach. For 42 years, I had believed I knew the woman sitting across from me at our kitchen table. I knew the way she took her coffee. I knew the little crease that appeared between her eyebrows whenever she was worried. I knew how she hummed while making dinner. I knew what she looked like when she was angry, or at least I thought I did. That Tuesday morning, she placed her coffee on the table, folded her hands, and looked directly into my eyes. I want a divorce. 4 words. No trembling voice. No tears. No hesitation. I stared at her for a few seconds. Then I asked the question any husband would ask. Why? She looked toward the window. There's someone else. His name was Richard. A man she had apparently been seeing for months. She told me she had fallen in love with him. She told me she was tired of pretending. She told me she wanted to start over. What she didn't tell me was that Richard had already started planning our ending, and I wouldn't discover that until later. At that moment I simply nodded. Okay. My wife blinked. Okay. Yes. She had expected anger. Maybe shouting. Maybe tears. Instead, I calmly picked up my coffee and took another sip. Something changed in her expression. For the first time that morning she looked nervous. I remember thinking, why was she disappointed that I wasn't fighting? Then I began noticing things. She wasn't asking about our marriage. She wasn't asking about the photographs. She wasn't asking what would happen to our memories. She was asking about our assets, the house, the investment accounts, my father's inheritance. She wanted numbers, exact numbers. She wanted to know what she would receive after the divorce. And suddenly, her affair didn't look like the reason for the divorce. It looked like the excuse. So I started looking into Richard. Quietly. No confrontation. No accusations. I simply watched. And what I found made my blood run cold. Richard wasn't just her lover. He was a financial advisor. And for months, he had been discussing our finances with her. Our property. Our investments. Our future. Apparently, he had convinced my wife that divorcing me would give her access to a fortune she had spent years believing was partly hers. They weren't ending a marriage. They were dismantling a life. And they thought I hadn't noticed. That was their mistake. Because there was something they didn't know. Something I had kept hidden for nearly 20 years. My father's money. The inheritance my wife was so interested in. Wasn't actually mine anymore. 20 years earlier, when our marriage was going through one of its worst periods, I had placed the money into a private trust. There was only one beneficiary. A person my wife hadn't seen in almost 40 years. Our daughter, Emily. My wife had never spoken about her. Not once. When Emily was 18 months old, my wife had given her up for adoption. She said she wasn't ready to be a mother. I begged her not to do it. She wouldn't listen. And after Emily was gone, my wife buried the memory so deeply that eventually, she acted as though our daughter had never existed. But I never forgot. I searched for Emily for years. Eventually I found her. She didn't want money. She didn't want revenge. She only wanted to understand why her mother had abandoned her. So I stayed in her life quietly, from a distance. And when my father left me his fortune, I made one decision. I protected Emily's future. My wife knew nothing. Richard knew nothing. And that was why I didn't fight the divorce. I let them believe they had one. I signed the papers. I gave my wife the house. I gave her the furniture. I gave her exactly what the divorce agreement required. And when Richard congratulated her on finally becoming free, I said nothing. Because they were celebrating an illusion. 2 months later, my wife moved into a luxury apartment with Richard. She called me once. Her voice sounded almost cheerful. You know, she said, maybe this is better for both of us. I looked out the window of the house we had shared for 42 years. Then I said, maybe it is. That was the last conversation we had. For 6 months I heard nothing. Then at 2:17 on a Tuesday morning my phone rang. It was my wife. She was crying. Not angry. Not bitter. Terrified. "You knew," she whispered. I sat up in bed. Knew what? There was silence. Then she said 2 words. "About Emily." My heart stopped. She had found her. Somehow my wife had discovered the trust. She had discovered where the inheritance had gone. And she had discovered the daughter she had spent 40 years pretending didn't exist. But then she said something that changed everything. Richard knew about the trust. I closed my eyes. Of course he did. The moment my wife discovered she couldn't touch the money, Richard had apparently told her they needed another solution. And that solution was Emily. They believed she could be manipulated. They believed she could be pressured into giving them access. They were wrong. Because Emily already knew everything. She knew about the trust. She knew about the divorce. She knew about Richard. And most importantly, she knew why I had protected her. The next evening, my wife came to my house. She stood on my porch for nearly a minute before knocking. When I opened the door, I barely recognized her. She looked exhausted, older. The confidence was gone. She stared at me. "Why didn't you tell me?" I knew what she meant. Why hadn't I told her about Emily? Why hadn't I told her about the trust? Why hadn't I stopped her? I could have exposed everything. I could have destroyed her plans the moment I discovered them. But I didn't. I looked at her and said, "Because you stopped asking what we were building together." Her eyes filled with tears. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Then she whispered, "Did you ever love me?" I thought about 42 years. The wedding. The children. The holidays. The arguments. The quiet mornings. All those ordinary moments that had once felt permanent. "Yes," I said. "I did." She looked down. "And now?" I closed the door gently. "Now I love the man I became after you left." And that was the end. Not with revenge. Not with shouting. Not with some dramatic courtroom victory. Just a door closing on a marriage that had already ended long before the divorce papers were signed. My wife thought she had walked away with everything. She didn't realize that the one thing she could never take from me was the future I had already protected. Sometimes revenge isn't about destroying the person who hurt you. Sometimes it's simply letting them walk away believing they won, until they finally discover what they lost. So tell me, if you discovered that the person you loved for 42 years had secretly planned to take everything from you, would you confront them? Or would you let them believe they had already won?